The first time the narrator noticed the woman cutting across the driveway, it seemed harmless. Just a brisk pace, a determined posture, and a sense of entitlement that clung to her like perfume. At the time, it was easy to assume she was simply lost or taking an unintended detour. The neighborhood was still new to the narrator, freshly moved in from a quieter suburb where people waved at each other and respected property lines simply out of habit. This place, however, had its own ecosystem of unspoken rules, silent rivalries, and neighbors whose routines were studied by others as if they were episodes of a show that never stopped airing. But this woman, later known as Karen, though the narrator only learned her name after weeks of uninvited crossings, never looked confused. If anything, she walked with the self-assured gait of someone who believed she belonged everywhere and was inconvenienced by anyone who didn't see it the same way. She passed through the narrator's driveway almost daily, sometimes more than once, treating the long concrete stretch like a public road designed specifically for her. She carried a small clutch bag and a phone she rarely looked up from, stepping over flower borders and decorative stones without so much as acknowledging they existed. The narrator watched her from a window that offered a clear view of the driveway and the sliver of yard beside it. Each time she strode through, she left small traces of intrusion. A slightly kicked-up line of pebbles from the decorative edging, a faint pathway forming in the grass along the side, a shift in the narrator's piece that grew heavier day by day. Still, the narrator hesitated to act, partly out of the desire to avoid unnecessary conflict, and partly out of disbelief that someone could be so casual about crossing into space that was so obviously not theirs. In the following weeks, the habit escalated. The woman expanded her path, straying closer to the house, sometimes even brushing past the parked car, as if it were an inconvenient obstacle rather than someone else's personal property. She began carrying small grocery bags, using the narrator's driveway as a shortcut from the community walkway to her own backyard gate. Each crossing felt more deliberate than the last, as if she were testing boundaries, seeing how far she could go before someone pushed back. Word around the neighborhood traveled quickly, though never directly to the narrator. There were whispers exchanged between dog walkers, quiet side comments shared between joggers, and the unmistakable buzzing energy of neighbors who were always half watching, half listening. The narrator eventually learned that the woman had a reputation, not for kindness or community spirit, but for claiming authority she didn't have. She frequently referred to common spaces as her extended yard, insisted that the HOA consult her on landscaping decisions, and treated every sidewalk, path, and patch of grass as though it bowed to her supposed influence. Even still, the narrator said nothing. Not yet. There was a cautious hope that she might stop on her own, perhaps after realizing how absurd her daily trespassing was. But entitlement never dissolves without resistance. It accumulates strength when left unchallenged. One morning, after a late spring rain had darkened the concrete, the narrator stepped outside to find fresh footprints trailing directly across the driveway. They were unmistakably hers, small, narrow, angled with the same purposeful stride she always had. But now there was something new. The imprint of mud smeared against the narrator's car door. It wasn't deep nor damaging, but it was enough to confirm that she had gotten close enough to brush against the vehicle. The moment solidified what had previously been a nagging annoyance into a clearly defined invasion. The narrator began documenting the crossings, not in anger, but in precaution. A camera was installed above the garage, angled discreetly but directly at the driveway. Each recording captured her unmistakable form. The posture, the pace, the practiced ignorance of boundaries. Days turned into weeks, and soon there was a growing archive of her trespasses, each time-stamped and saved. Then came the day that changed everything. The narrator returned home to find a pair of lawn stakes lying sideways along the driveway's edge. They had previously marked the boundary where grass met concrete. Simple markers meant to keep the landscaping clean and defined. Now they were tossed aside as though they had offended someone. A closer look revealed deep, fresh footprints pressed into the soil beside them, carving a new, wider path directly through the narrator's yard. The woman had not only claimed the driveway. She had begun expanding her imaginary shortcut, as if the property line were nothing more than a flexible suggestion. That evening, as the narrator reviewed the footage, something unexpected appeared. The woman wasn't just cutting through. She had stopped mid-path, bent down, pulled the boundary stakes out of the ground, examined them briefly with a dismissive tilt of her head, and tossed them aside before continuing her walk with a huff of annoyance. The trespassing was no longer subtle. It had evolved into active interference. Word of the incident spread quickly after the narrator quietly mentioned it to a neighbor seeking advice. The community had seen variations of this behavior before, though rarely this bold. Neighbors recounted stories of her attempting to shift garden borders, claiming shrubs were in her way, and insisting that the walking route behind the homes was too long and poorly designed. But then something even more alarming surfaced. An older couple, having lived in the neighborhood for nearly a decade, mentioned that her backyard fence sat unusually far forward compared to others on the street. They had raised the concern years ago, but nothing ever came of it. A spark of curiosity ignited in the narrator's mind. Combined with the woman's obsessive insistence that the narrator's driveway was part of some community walkway, the puzzle pieces began forming a larger picture. It became clear that she wasn't just using property she didn't own. She might genuinely believe she had a right to it, and sometimes, people who believe such things do so because they've benefited from similar delusions before. The narrator had two choices: confront her directly or approach the situation carefully, methodically, with evidence and precision. In a neighborhood governed by rules, regulations, and the ever-watchful eye of the HOA, the latter path offered more certainty and less chaos. It was time for a property survey. As the narrator prepared to set the process in motion, an uneasy anticipation settled in. The woman had grown increasingly bold, and whatever the survey uncovered had the potential to unravel more than just a trespassing issue. Property lines were definitive. They did not bend for convenience. And if the rumors were true, she had been walking across and possibly building on land that was never hers to begin with. By the end of the week, the appointment was set. The stakes, both literal and figurative, were about to be reestablished. The driveway, so casually claimed as her walking path, was about to reveal the truth she had ignored for years. The surveyor arrived early on a crisp morning when the sun was still stretching across the rooftops, painting long, deliberate shadows that seemed to emphasize every line, every edge, every border. The narrator watched from the porch as the man unloaded his equipment. Precision tools, markers, a tripod, and a measuring instrument that gleamed with quiet authority. It felt almost ceremonial, as though this ritual of measurement would finally bring order to the creeping chaos that had invaded the driveway and the narrator's peace of mind. The surveyor was calm, methodical, accustomed to dealing with homeowners who approached him with a mix of curiosity, uncertainty, or concealed panic. He asked no unnecessary questions. He had already been provided with the plat maps and the original builder documentation. He simply glanced at the property, nodded knowingly, and began marking the first point. The narrator kept a respectful distance but remained close enough to observe as he stretched lines, checked angles, and placed flags with the confidence of someone uncovering truth buried beneath years of assumption. Each movement felt like peeling back a layer of the community's quiet dysfunction. The ground itself seemed to respond, acknowledging where it had been misrepresented, misused, or quietly claimed by those who believed boundaries were merely suggestions. By midday, the surveyor paused, looked down at his clipboard, and then at the small cluster of flags now arranged in a way that felt both startling and strangely vindicating. He had uncovered something significant, though he spoke carefully and professionally when he explained it. The driveway was unquestionably and entirely on the narrator's property. No shared easements, no community access points, no overlapping designations that could even remotely justify someone treating it as a walkway. The woman's self-appointed shortcut was nothing more than trespassing dressed in entitlement. But that wasn't the revelation that mattered most. The real surprise was behind the narrator's home, where the surveyor spent a considerable amount of time confirming boundary lines that angled between yards. It was here that his tempo shifted, where his carefully measured steps grew more deliberate, and where he measured and remeasured distances as though confirming something unexpected. When he finally placed the last flag behind the neighbor's fence, behind her fence, the truth became unmistakable. Her fence extended several feet beyond her actual property line. Not inches. Not a modest, barely noticeable shift that could be dismissed as a measurement error or a contractor's oversight. The encroachment was large enough to be deliberate, unmistakably intentional, and entirely illegal. She had been occupying land that wasn't hers for years, including a strip of the narrator's side yard that had likely never been recognized as stolen simply because previous homeowners hadn't looked closely enough that it was a quiet theft, masked under the guise of normal neighborhood fencing. But now the stolen ground stood exposed, marked by bright plastic flags fluttering in the breeze like silent accusations. The narrator felt a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. It wasn't just that she had been cutting through the driveway. It wasn't just that she had tossed aside stakes, trampled grass, and carved a walkway into land that was never hers. The shortcut she claimed as a community path wasn't even the boldest theft she'd committed. She had built on stolen property. Not 1 foot, not 2, nearly 6 feet of lateral extension, taken without permission, paperwork, or shame. The surveyor documented everything meticulously. He created a detailed sketch, marked coordinates, and summarized the violations in a formal report. He worked with a calm that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing in the narrator's thoughts. When the work was complete, he handed over the preliminary findings with a quiet assurance that left no room for interpretation. The narrator's property had been intruded upon, both physically and legally, and there were protocols designed to address such matters. But in a neighborhood ruled by the HOA, a notoriously reactive, rigid, and often unpredictable entity, following those protocols promised drama. Resolution in a community was rarely as simple as presenting facts. Neighbors had alliances, grudges, and histories that shaped every dispute, often in ways that made truth a secondary factor. The narrator submitted the report to the HOA the next morning, attaching photographs, video stills, and a calm explanation of the ongoing trespassing. It was not a complaint written in anger, but in clarity, a collection of undeniable evidence presented with the hope of a responsible intervention. The HOA's board members responded with stiff politeness, promising to review the findings and initiate appropriate action. Their phrasing was cautious, the kind often used in delicate situations where they feared backlash. After all, Karen wasn't just any resident. She had built herself a presence on the board of gossip, influence, and relentless opinions. She wasn't an official board member, but she acted like one, speaking loudly enough at meetings that her voice became part of the atmosphere. Behind the scenes, the HOA members discussed the findings with rising concern. Property encroachment wasn't a trivial matter. It threatened insurance liabilities, boundary laws, and the sanctity of property values, 3 things HOAs were known to guard with absolute ferocity. Yet they also knew who they were dealing with. Addressing her meant confronting someone who wielded complaints like weapons. While the HOA deliberated, the narrator noticed a change in the woman's behavior. She continued crossing the driveway, but there was an anxious rhythm to her steps. She walked faster, glancing around more frequently, as though sensing that her claimed path was slipping from her grasp. She avoided looking at the new flags marking the corners of nearby yards, even as they stood out like neon warnings. The neighbors noticed too. Conversations swelled. The older couple who had once mentioned the misplaced fence shared knowing looks each time they passed by. Others whispered about the survey, connecting dots they had previously ignored. The community's quiet harmony had been pierced, replaced by subtle tension that simmered just beneath the surface. A week after the survey, the HOA finally issued a formal notice, a directive requiring the woman to remove and relocate her fence immediately. The document was stern, citing legal requirements, boundary violations, and a clear deadline for compliance. It also referenced her repeated trespassing, stating firmly that her use of the narrator's driveway as a walking path was prohibited and legally indefensible. The notice, printed and delivered in an unmistakable envelope, was placed squarely on her porch. The neighborhood held its breath. That afternoon, the narrator saw her retrieve the letter. She read only the first few lines before her posture stiffened. Her hands folded the paper with unnatural precision, as though controlling the edges might control the consequences. Her expression tightened. Her jaw clenched. She stood in silence for a long, brittle moment, and then, with deliberate steps, she marched toward the narrator's driveway. The trespassing wasn't over. In the days following the HOA's directive, the neighborhood moved with an uneasy tension, as though the air itself was waiting for the inevitable collision between entitlement and accountability. The woman, once so confident in her silent, daily crossing, now moved through the neighborhood with a brittle, simmering energy. She avoided eye contact, avoided the cluster of survey flags still marking the reality she refused to accept, and avoided any appearance of backing down, even as her world of imagined ownership began unraveling around her. But the driveway crossings didn't stop. If anything, they became more performative, more aggressive in their silent message. Each step she took across that concrete was a declaration that she didn't recognize the boundaries placed before her, neither the physical stakes nor the legal ones. She walked as though the HOA notice were nothing more than a suggestion, a minor inconvenience she planned to ignore until it simply disappeared. The narrator watched these crossings from behind windows, from the porch, even from inside the car. The trespasses were recorded, documented, cataloged. Each violation added to the growing pile of evidence that she had no intention of respecting the property lines that had now been proven undeniable. But sometimes, people who build their identity on imagined authority don't respond to clarity. They respond to force, to consequences that cannot be dismissed. The deadline for her fence removal approached with steady, unstoppable certainty. Neighbors waited to see whether she would comply, curious whether she would dismantle the structure that had, for years, symbolized her quiet annexation of land that wasn't hers. Yet every day, her fence stood unchanged, its panels firm, its posts unmoved. The section encroaching into the narrator's yard remained exactly where it had always been, as though she believed time itself would bend on her behalf. But time refused her. On the morning of the deadline, the neighborhood woke to the rumble of a truck. Not hers. She did not hire anyone. Instead, it belonged to a contractor retained by the HOA, authorized under the association's bylaws to enforce compliance when a resident refused to act. The workers stepped out with the calm indifference of professionals accustomed to conflict. They carried tools designed not for persuasion but for resolution. The narrator stood at a distance, watching as the workers inspected the flagged boundary line and measured the fence. Their tape extended across the soil, confirming the exact distance of the encroachment with precise finality. Every inch of stolen ground was accounted for. Every unauthorized claim was laid bare. When the workers prepared to dismantle the fence, the woman emerged. Her fury was silent at first, a posture rigid with disbelief, a breath held too long. She approached them not with reason but with outrage built on years of unchecked assumption. Though no dialogue filled the moment, her expression conveyed everything: indignation, shock, humiliation, and the deep, instinctive panic of someone whose imagined world was collapsing. She stood near the edge of the driveway, still trespassing even in her emotional upheaval, and gestured wildly toward the fence, toward her yard, toward the narrator's home. It was a silent performance of protest, a frantic attempt to reclaim authority through expression alone. But the workers didn't look at her. They continued their task with quiet efficiency, guided by paperwork and boundaries that cared nothing for temper. The first panel came down with a hollow thud. The second followed, its removal revealing a strip of earth that had been hidden for years, now exposed to the light like a long-concealed secret. As each section fell, the illusion of her extended yard dissolved. What she had claimed as hers was stripped away piece by piece, until the full reality stood undeniable. She had built her world on land that was never hers to touch. The narrator watched the unraveling not with satisfaction, but with a calm sense of restoration. The land seemed to breathe again, freed from the weight of misappropriation. The driveway felt wider somehow, no longer shadowed by her passing. Even the grass appeared to stand taller, as though reclaiming its rightful place in the world. But the fall of the fence did not end the ordeal. The HOA issued her a formal violation notice detailing fines, administrative fees, and the cost of the forced removal. The amount was significant, substantial enough to reflect years of misuse and defiance. It was a financial reckoning that mirrored the physical one happening in her yard. Neighbors whispered quietly, their conversations more sympathetic toward the narrator than toward her. Many had tolerated her behavior for years, treating her entitlement as an inevitable quirk of community life. But the survey had exposed not just trespassing, but prolonged exploitation. Her shortcut, once tolerated as an odd habit, now symbolized a deeper, persistent disregard for everyone's boundaries. Even so, she continued to cross the driveway. Not daily anymore, but sporadically, as though she needed to reassure herself that not everything had been taken from her. Each crossing seemed weaker than the last, her steps less certain, her posture no longer radiating the absolute confidence she once wore so effortlessly. The narrator documented every instance, not out of spite but out of necessity, knowing that patterns matter when people refuse to accept reality. Eventually, after several violations, the HOA issued a cease and desist order. It was final, unambiguous, and legally binding. If she crossed the driveway again, she would face legal action that extended far beyond fines or board meetings. The document was delivered without fanfare, placed directly into her hands by an HOA representative who carried no softness in their expression. After that day, her footsteps vanished from the narrator's driveway. The neighborhood slowly returned to its natural rhythm. People smiled more easily. Conversations drifted back to ordinary topics: gardening, weather, small improvements to their homes. The survey flags were removed, replaced by new boundary stakes that carried a quiet, unshakable authority. The narrator tended to the once trampled grass, restoring what had been worn down by years of entitled footsteps. The woman kept to herself. Her presence shrank, her influence diminished, her aura of control evaporated. She no longer held court at HOA meetings or lingered near sidewalks to insert herself into conversations. The shortcut she had defended so fiercely became nothing more than a fading memory, a path that had never existed in the first place. As seasons shifted and time smoothed out the lingering tension, the driveway remained untouched. It stood as it always had, private, defined, and officially protected by the boundaries that the survey had restored. The narrator reclaimed the space not through confrontation, but through patience, documentation, and unwavering commitment to the truth and the end. The woman learned that property lines weren't suggestions, shortcuts weren't rights, and entitlement was no match for evidence. The land returned to its rightful owner, and the driveway, once mistaken for a community path, became a symbol of reclaimed boundaries and the quiet power of standing firm.